if this story was a question that you were exploring, could you say what that question was?
Yeah, that's a really interesting way to come at it. How do we be okay when we wake up to history? That's the question. I think that's my question. And that can be a really big question of the history of Australia, but it can also be quite a small question of the history of your family, or just even when you become more aware of the real people who are your parents or your siblings or your friends, when you start to kind of really grow into that acknowledgement of all these other existences and the fact that they impact you, and even more importantly that you impact them. That would be the question. That's a pretty big and deep question.
Yeah, you had your work cut out.
I did. You threw me a curly one pretty early.
You wrote the book, and I think that sounds like rich material to explore. And then, well, maybe in that vein, it's a very, or I can see how it would be a very Australian question. And then reading a bit more about you and your work being described as Australian contemporary Gothic, I suppose, do you think Where We Begin fits in that categorization as well? And if so, can you explain for someone who maybe doesn't really know what that term means, you know, in a day-to-day sense, what does Australian contemporary Gothic look like?
Yeah. So you have to kind of go back and then back. So there's Australian contemporary Gothic, Australian Gothic, Gothic. Yes, it does. I was quite, here it is, here's the book. I was being quite, isn't the cover amazing? I'm sorry, I love it. I was being quite intentional with the Australian Gothic nature of this novel. Someone described my last novel as Australian Gothic, and I hadn't conceived of it that way, but it really did fit and I kind of loved it. So I went, right, okay, Gothic, let's go. But for me, the Gothic is those Victorian European novels like Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, and the Daphne du Mauriers like Rebecca and My Cousin Rachel. And I love them, problematic as they are, mostly on race. They're pretty bad on race. But they do tend to tackle issues of gender and race and sexuality, which was quite unusual for the time. Okay, so the Gothic tradition kind of comes out of a reaction against the Enlightenment in Europe, which is really like everything's very science-based now. We're rational creatures now, and we're civilized, and humanity is the pinnacle of evolution. And then the Romantic period came in where it's no, let's go back to nature and let's re-invite mystery. And then these novels started coming out, which are all very much about setting and landscape and mood and the supernatural and crumbling old buildings, so human civilization starting to decay. So that's where the Gothic comes from. That was getting big at the same time as Australia was being invaded and colonized, pretty much. So we, us whiteys, we transplanted that here and brought with us all the stuff about the mystery and the threat and things being unsettling, but instead of it being kind of on the human civilization, we made the landscape the thing that we were all terrified of. So Australian Gothic tends to rely heavily on the landscape, as Gothic does, but because it's a white tradition that's been superimposed here, it does a strange little colonial thing there, which I'm actually actively trying to work against in this. So yes, probably is Australian contemporary Gothic. I don't know, there's my nutshell of Gothic and Australian Gothic and Australian contemporary Gothic.
No, I think that's a wonderful a specific crash course and captures.
And
You covered a lot of ground.
Setting a mood and, you know, unexplained events. That's pretty much it.